Okay, so we're continuing our study in history and geography of the Bible story, lesson 41, which is a review of the years of biblical silence and what brings us to this period of time. Prophecy, right?
Prophecy.
From what? From whom? Amos, Amos 8, chapter 8, verse 11, there would be a dearth or no longer a revelation from God and His people. So Amos prophesied that back several hundred years before it began, and as a result of that, we have a period of time between what we call between the Testaments, which was a period of about how many years?
400.
400, okay. All right, so in connection with that, we have been studying about 4 lessons that talks about this very thing. And today we're going to have a review of those things. And then we want to talk a little bit more about the proper time, the time that was prophesied about the coming of Jesus, and in between that lesson and our review, we will talk about the Herodian family just a little bit. And so I'm assuming everybody's ready and prepared for our review. I hope you are, and so we'll look at page 165 and answering these questions of a review of Bible silence. Remote to work here. They'd be dead. Okay, if I was on the right page. All right, here we go. So we're asked to, in the first section, to define some words or expressions that we've been talking about from time to time. Ken, we're going to start over here with you. Number 1, the Septuagint. What's the Septuagint?
70 scholars got together and translated from Hebrew into Greek.
Okay. What did they translate?
The Bible, the Old Testament.
The Old Testament. Okay. So, as Ken, if you couldn't hear that, Ken said 70 scholars got together to translate the Hebrew Old Testament text into Greek. And what was important about that? I'm sorry? Okay, that was the language that was spoken at that period of time, and so that meant that most everyone, especially those that were not Jews, would be able to understand the Old Covenant and how God dealt with His people and what He was moving mankind toward. And of course, that was the coming of Jesus. Fast. Okay, what's a God-fearer? What do you have for that, Billy?
I've got the Jewish people who fear God, but were not devout religious people.
Okay, all right. All right, you said Jewish people. Actually, those were people that were kind of converted to Judaism in a way. They really weren't full converts. In other words, they didn't follow the ceremonial rites of the Jewish people, and so these would have been Gentile converts to the extent that they would fear God, they knew who He was, yet they were not full-fledged Jews in the fact that they would follow after the Old Covenant and all of that had to do with that. Specifically, things like circumcision and other things like that. Okay, devout, pious, accepted to God of the Jews, but not all the ceremonial rites of the law. What about a proselyte? What do you have for that, Miss Janice?
I said a proselyte is a Gentile who accepted the complete law of Moses.
Okay, that's correct. So proselyte simply means to convert from one religion to another, basically. But in this particular instance, converting from whatever it was that they would have followed religiously to Judaism, as Ms. Janice has said. So the Gentiles to the Jews' religion, they accepted the complete law of Moses. The only difference between them and the Jews may have been skin color, may have been the way they were brought up. And so they would have been a Jew in every sense of the word except for the natural birth that they had of a Gentile family. Right, then there is the synagogue. What do you have for that, Ellen?
The word means gathering. It's a place of assembly for the Jewish people.
Okay. Place for Jews worship. And this must have come about sometime during the years of biblical silence, because we don't hear about the synagogue until later on. And I imagine after the after the remnant returned from Babylonian captivity, they built the walls of the city, they rebuilt the temple. And the time following that, up until the time Christ came, somewhere in there would have been the time when the synagogues would have been established. And of course, there would not have been a need for the synagogue in Jerusalem. For what reason?
What was there?
Okay, the temple was there, that's right. The synagogues were in places like Antioch of Syria and other places where we find Paul and some of the others traveling. They found synagogues. Even Jesus spoke in certain synagogues in Galilee and other places like that. All right, Hellenistic. What does that term mean? Hellenistic. What do you have, Murphy?
Greek culture and philosophy.
Okay. All right, one that was raised up under the Greek culture, a style of Greek civilization associated with the spread of Greek language and culture. I've often wondered if that had anything to do with Helen of Troy. I don't know if that's the case or not. I really didn't go back and look at that to see if that had anything to do with her. But nonetheless, we know what that is.
Jeremy?
Yes.
It might, but the Greek name for Greece, I think, was Hellas.
Okay,
I
Hellas.
think that's what it's.
Yeah, okay. All right. And for example, the Hellespont that we talked about, that body of water between the two peninsulas there. So that's very interesting. Thank you for that comment. Gentile, what do you have for that, Linda?
Anyone who wasn't a Jew.
Okay. All right. And Jewish people were actually the ones that named people this, weren't they? Gave this name to those who were foreigners, people not of the Jewish race. So very, very good in that connection. Okay. Maccabee. What do you got that? Okay. What about it, Horace? You have that?
The Jewish priestly family who led and revolted against the Seleucid Empire.
Mm-hmm. Right, the Seleucids, yes. And they were members of the Hasmonean family. That particular phrase was given to, or that particular name was given to Judas in particular. Anybody know what Maccabee means?
Hammer.
Hammer, right, that's right. So they called Judas Maccabee or Hammer because of his ability to fight and use the type of warfare that he used. I don't want to give away a further answer, but I'll cover that in just a minute. Okay, Feast of Dedication. Debbie, what do you have for that?
It was a feast to celebrate the retaking of Jerusalem and the temple
Okay,
by Judas.
all right. By the way, just for extra points, do you know what the name of that is today? Hanukkah, right. Yeah, and it's celebrated sometime in December. And we find that Jesus took part in that feast of dedication as well while he was on the earth. All right, then we come to identifying characteristics concerning these four groups of people. First, Dusty, the Essenes.
Identified as the separated ones, considered Pharisees membership of the potentially represents ones.
Okay, all right. Had strict discipline, as Dusty mentioned. They're separated. They shared possessions. They were kind of a remote group. Today, people would refer to those types of people as a cult, just simply because they live out by themselves and that type of thing. but the Essenes were continuing to wait for the Messiah, and they were not lavish people by any stretch of the imagination. Okay, how about the Pharisees? Al?
They were a strict middle class group of Jews. They rejected all Greek influence. They followed tradition more than scripture.
Okay. All right, very good. They had a strong commitment to the law, believed in the resurrection of the dead, that their motives were wrong, hearts were far from God. Okay, and then the Zealots. Oliver, what do you have for those?
Devoted to Jewish law and religion, but did not agree to pay tribute to Caesar.
Okay, all right. And these were some of the strictest people, I guess, if we thought that the Pharisees thought that the, how does he use that in our workbook? Maybe he says the Sadducees thought that the Pharisees were too strict. The Zealots thought that the Pharisees were too liberal. So they were very zealous in regard to what they thought was coming. And then the Sadducees. Mom, do you have that? Okay, John?
High priests who were very aware of political compromise. They were wealthy, believed in God of the law, but they rejected most of tradition and interpretations of Pharisees. They doubted life after death. Supernatural beings like angels were foolish to them. They wanted Jewish way of life to continue, that they were willing to compromise for political advantages.
Okay. All right. The Sadducees made up the greater part of what body? Sanhedrin, right. Excuse me. They were also mainly high priests and that type of thing in the first century. All right, let's go. Any questions about that? Let's go on then to the capital cities of the Roman Empire. And I know that you won't be able to see that. Let me see if I can make that a little bit larger there. I think that'll help somewhat. Okay, back to you, Ken. Egypt. What was the capital of Egypt this time? Recall? There was a vast library there.
Oh, Alexandria.
Alexandria, right. Okay. All right. So there is the region of Egypt and the city of Alexandria there between the last two cataracts of the last two western cataracts of the Nile River. All right. What about Syria? Ken? You might see a little bit about that. Billy, what do you have for that?
We got Antioch.
Antioch, okay. Antioch of Syria. Let me readjust my map here, see if I can do that. There's the region of Syria and Antioch there, almost at the top, northeastern corner of the Mediterranean coastline, the city of Antioch. And what else do we know about Antioch from the New Testament? Anybody? Kind of looking ahead.
Paul preached there.
Okay.
In the synagogue. In the synagogue.
Okay, in the synagogue, right. All right, and then there was Greece. What was the capital of Greece at this particular time? Athens, yes ma'am, that's correct, Athens. And so there's the peninsula, and Athens would be on the southern, southeastern portion of that particular peninsula. All right, now let me adjust our scale back down a little bit, and we'll talk about some rulers. Now, we also, before we get into this, we talked about in connection with the Roman Empire, in the beginning of it, they really didn't have one steadfast leader like Greece did. You know, Greece had Philip of Macedon to begin with, and then he was killed, and his son Alexander came to power. And so, we know all about Alexander and his exploits. But Rome was not like that until later on. And so they began to have generals and other rulers that would put themselves forward as being, important and political leaders. And so at this particular time, we're still talking a little bit about those that were put in place by Greece. Remember, there were 4 generals under Alexander that he placed over became placed over the areas that were ruled by the Grecians. And the Romans kind of inherited that somewhat until they were able to get their arrangement of government fixed so that they could control those areas. So keep that in mind as we answer these. Who was the general who conquered from Greece to India? Ellen, what do you have for that?
Alexander the Great.
Alexander the Great, that's right. Mark, the king who called himself Zeus.
Antiochus IV.
That's right, Antiochus IV, or also known as Antiochus Epiphanes, right. Okay. All right, who ruled the Egyptian dynasty, Murphy? Ptolemies did, that's right. There were, we know at least 12 of those leaders under the Ptolemy name. May have been more. The Syrian dynasty. Linda, what do you have for that? You don't have that one? Okay. Nick, you got that? Okay, how about it, Horace? Okay. Under the Syrian dynasty, that would have been the Seleucids. Seleucids, right. Yeah. Okay. All right. Remember that Antiochus is a little bit later than when the Seleucids came into power under the Grecian rule. It was Seleucus Nicator that was actually the first ruler of the Seleucids, and then they, from that lineage, from that line, they continued to rule until the Herods began to rule, and that Antiochus falls in between there. We'll talk more about that in a few moments. All right, the Maccabean dynasty. What was their family name, Debbie?
It was the
Hasmonean or Hasmoneus family, right? So that started out with Mattathias and his 4 sons. I can't remember, but Judas and Jonathan. But Jonathan was the youngest. Judas was the Maccabee or the Hammer, and I don't remember the other ones that were put in power at that time. Okay, the Roman general who conquered Jerusalem. Who was the first one to do that? Pompey, that's right. He was the one that came in and broke down the wall, right? Under the guise of, I'm going to help y'all straighten out all these civil unrests. But then he came in and wanted to take over. The first general of the Maccabean revolt. Jews, okay, right. The ruler Julius Caesar set up over Egypt. Audrey? Cleopatra. That's right. What else do we know about Cleopatra? Anybody? Ken?
Mark Antony.
Yeah, she was connected with Mark Antony, right? And we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. The king of Judea when Christ was born. Who was that, John?
I have Herod.
Herod. Which Herod? Do you know? Herod the Great, that's right. All right, Ken, emperor of Rome when Christ was born. Also known as Octavian. Anybody?
Caesar Augustus.
Augustus Caesar, that's right. That's right. Yes. All right, so again, not in any particular order. Those rulers that we've talked about, we've got a mixture of Greek rulers and a mixture of what was left over from Alexander's empire, really, and a mixture of Roman rulers there. And so don't try to put that into any chronological order necessarily. Okay, short answers. Number one, Billy, what was the official language of the Grecian empires? Greek. Okay, makes sense, doesn't it? And Greek was, as Alexander conquered, just go back a little bit. As Alexander conquered and he went from city to city, what did he have his people do? As far as the city was concerned, Dustin? Yeah, model Greek cities. And he would also enforce the Greek language. And so you can imagine someone coming in and taking over. Let's say, for example, we have someone that comes in and takes over Alabama. This is a little hilarious, really. Can you imagine Alabamians being subjected to learn Chinese? That would be something, wouldn't it? But that would be somewhat similar to what happened when Alexander came through city to city to city. So we've got, at this point in time, we've got Aramaic, we've got Hebrew, we've got whatever languages the Egyptians spoke, and that may have been Aramaic as well. But then to learn this other language, and probably not as much difference between that and Greek and Southern English and Chinese, but nonetheless it was a different language, okay? So the official language then being Greek. And the importance of that was what? Enforcing the Greek language is that you've got it all throughout the known world at this time, and what happens, Ken?
Easy to spread the gospel.
Yeah, easy to spread the gospel. Do you see the working of God in all of this? We talked about the time, Paul wrote to the Galatian churches. Here was the perfect time for Christ to come. And so, God's setting in place these stair steps, if you will, that makes it just right for him to come into power and come to be able to tell people about what they should do to be pleasing to God. Do you have another point?
Just that many of Alexander was conquering a whole lot, but many of the cities were very, very glad to have him take over and they presented no opposition.
That's right. That's right. And it would have been easier in his job to be able to make those city-states or those model cities, if you will. Anniston's called a model city. I don't know what we're modeled after, really. But you can see how that idea, kind of originated back there with the Grecian Empire, in that they came in and broke off the chains of the Medo-Persians, which, the Medo-Persian Empire was somewhat more amiable than others. Babylonians and especially the Assyrians before them, very wicked and cruel people. And so they were in many ways glad to see them come in, as you stated. What was the daily language in the homes of Palestine? Where are we? Janice? What do you have? Aramaic. That's right. Aramaic, which was a very ancient language, right? Where did the Aramaic language came from? It came from Mesopotamia, right? So the people of Aram began that language, and there was a very somewhat similar, I should say, languages during that time, but Aramaic really took over for whatever reason. I imagine it had to do with political power. What language were the Old Testament scriptures written in, Ellen?
Hebrew, except for 6 chapters in Daniel, Ezra, I think there's a passage in Genesis and
Okay, well, let's weigh you under more than what I expected, but yeah, you're right. That's good. Good answer. Good answer, yes. Generally speaking, Hebrew, and then the Septuagint came along, and that brought it over into Greek. Okay, very good. All right, Mark, why was there hatred between the Jews and the Samaritans?
The Samaritans rejected Jewish traditions, and the Jews believed the Samaritans had left the Jewish faith.
Okay. And what happened in Samaria when Nebuchadnezzar, or when, rather, when Sennacherib came in, Assyria took over the people and took them out of Israel? What did they do? What did Assyria do with that region?
Bring other people.
Yeah, they brought other peoples in. And what peoples were left when he took all of the captives to Assyria?
The poorest of the land.
Sorry?
The poorest of the land.
All right, the poorest of the poor. And so those folks were left. The other people brought in, and so there was an intermarriage and all that, made a mixture of races. And so they weren't pure, were they? They weren't Jews any longer, really. And so that's where the term Samaritan comes from. All right, very good. And also, you remember during the days of Ezra and Nehemiah that Sanballat and Tobiah and others came in, and they began to cause problems with trying to rebuild Jerusalem. They had, I believe it was maybe 14 or 16 years that they stopped the work because they had sent a letter over to one of the rulers of Persia and said, listen, these people have always been causing trouble. You need to stop this. And so they were able to do that for a period of time. And so that conflict was there as well. All right, now, who was the prophet who predicted a famine of hearing the word of God? You already gave us that answer once, Murphy.
Amos.
Amos, okay. Amos in chapter 8, verse 11. What brought about the Maccabean revolt, Linda?
Basically, emperor worship.
Right. Antiochus Epiphanes comes to, or Antiochus IV, comes to power. He's got a lot of pressure from Rome on him. They've crippled him with attacks. So he's going to try and lift himself up out of that. And so he's going to make himself God, essentially. So he gives himself the title of Epiphanes, and he says, I'm Zeus. Sounds like some other religion that we know, right? Here I am, God on earth.
Roman Catholic.
Yeah. John?
They favored one sect than the other, too.
Okay.
The rulers did.
Okay. All right. You're talking about Antiochus.
No. Let me look. I can't read my writing.
Oh, I don't know what
Maccabean revolt.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. After the initial revolt, you know, after Judas and Jonathan had died, then, you know, just kind of every type of fellow that has a little bit of power tried to take over Jerusalem and that surrounding area. And so that's what you're talking about there at the end of that era. Okay, very good. What did the Greeks call Judah? Or Judea, okay. And what they call Edom? Harris? Idumea, right. Judea and Idumea. All right, let's move along. Who was the first Jew to publicly protest the Syrian order to worship Zeus? Did it? I'm sorry, I can hear you.
Matthias.
Okay, right. Matthias Hasmoneus. And I don't know why they put that N in there. It really should be an S. But anyway, that was his name. He was the patriarch, kind of the Maccabean revolt. You know, Antiochus sends his messenger, and he sends another Jew to force Matthias to accept Zeus worship. And Mattathias says, I'd rather die in the religion of my fathers. And he wound up killing both of those guys. And this was somewhat an elderly man. He didn't put up with that kind of stuff. So let's summarize the kind of battles the Maccabees fought against the Syrians, Dustin. Guerrilla warfare, that's right. Strike and hide, and kind of assimilate into the populace. Okay, very good. Why was the Septuagint valuable now?
It gave Greek speakers access to the scripture.
Okay. Right. Okay, what were some of the major lessons the Israelites learned from their captivity? Audrey?
No idol worship, obedience to God, and bringing God's blessings.
Okay. God always takes care of his people, doesn't he? And he told them a remnant would be brought out of captivity, and that's what he did. Could there have been more that came out of captivity? Did it? So everyone didn't come, right? Okay, so that remnant was even smaller than those that survived the captivity. Which prophet foretold that Christ would be born in Bethlehem, John?
Micah.
Okay, Micah chapter 5 and verse 2. Bethlehem Ephratah. All right, so now we're going to put in order the empires, the kingdoms during our time of captivity and all of those things that were connected with our study in the past 3 or 4 weeks. What's the first empire in chronological order, Ken?
Babylon.
Look again.
Assyria.
There you go. Assyria was number 1. What was number 2? We'll just keep going with you, Ken. What's number 2?
Babylon.
Okay. All right. Number 2 is Babylon. What's number 3, Ken? Persia. All right. Let's finish them out. 4.
I've got 4 as Greece.
Greece, right. And then that leaves us Rome to be number 5, right? All right, so that brings us then to Nebuchadnezzar's dream. What's the summary of that dream, Billy?
Nebuchadnezzar's dream was of the great image. It was the gold head, the silver breast, iron legs, clay feet, brass lower body.
Okay. All right.
Represented the 4 empires.
Right. That's right. And so what happened after that in that dream? He saw that image, and what happened? Ken?
I forget what it was that started, but it grew into a large mountain. The image.
Okay, so boulder, not hewn by hands of men, came down and crushed the image. All right, very good. And so what is the interpretation of that, Miss Janice? Do you have that dream?
I have that Christ is the stone.
That's right. He is, and so he would come and the church would be established as a result of that, and that would be an everlasting kingdom that would not be torn down, okay? Would not be destroyed. Very good. All right, so now let's name the empires from the time of Nebuchadnezzar's dream until the birth of Christ. What we got there, Ellen?
I don't know this.
Okay. Just 4 of them.
Medo-Persia, Greek, and Rome.
Right. Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greek, and the Roman Empire. Which one of the 5 empires is left out, Mark?
The Assyria.
Yes.
Was before his dream.
Yeah, that happened before Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Very good. All right, so then we're going to come back and place these in chronological order, and we will be through with our review. So, number 1, Murphy, what do you have for that?
Alexander the Great conquered the Indus River.
Okay. We'll look at that again.
Alexander the Great conquered the Jewish right with that.
All right. Who came before Alexander? Look in your list there. Who came before Alexander? Nebuchadnezzar. Okay. Nebuchadnezzar had a dream of a great image. Remember, Nebuchadnezzar was of what kingdom? Babylonian. That's right. That's right. All right, Linda, what do you have for number 2? Okay. This is Murphy's answer. Alexander the Great conquered to the Indus River. All right, 3. Nick, you have that? Maccabean revolt. Horace, 4.
Rome conquered all eastern Mediterranean shore.
Right, very good. Okay, Debbie, 5.
I have Herod the king becomes the king of Judea.
Herod the Great becomes king of Judea. Yes. Dusty, 6.
Augustus Caesar.
Yes, and then we have the birth of Christ, right? Okay, very good. So, a lot of information. And as I mentioned, we got started back there in chapter 37. I said, we don't have a whole lot of scripture to look at right here. We're going to have to rely mainly upon history, but there are some other things that we see in the scriptures that point back to what occurred in those 400 years. We know, it's a well-known thing that the Grecian Empire was what it was, that the Roman Empire was what it was. And we have well-documented cases and places where the Caesars reigned. And so that history is very easy to put together. What happened to the people of God during that particular time? Well, we really don't know except to look at the New Testament and see what occurred between the end of Ezra, Nehemiah, Malachi, and what began there in the Gospels. So, appreciate you hanging in there with me. I know some of that was a little bit dry, especially if you're not a history buff. But we'll go on now to the Herod family and look at that for just a few moments. Let me get that PowerPoint up really quick here. All right, here we go. Now, I'll tell you, if you thought that, all of that about the way that the Grecian Empire was split up was a little bit confusing. Boy, the Herod family is really something. You could take the Herod family and you could put them into the 21st century and they would look just like some of our families today. And that's not really saying a good thing. What I mean by that is that there was all kinds of stuff going on among family members and it just intermarriage and all that kind of stuff, and it's kind of sad. But God uses these rulers to bring about what He needs to be brought about in the first century and earlier, to bring Christ into the world, to separate Christ, if you will, from, and I hate to put it this way, from other children that were born during that particular time. Very terrible thing that occurred there, but let's just go ahead and get started in our lesson. And so there were several, as we see on the chart, several Roman rulers in the Palestine region during Jesus' earthly ministry in the period shortly before His birth and after His resurrection. These are the main characters. We already know Herod the Great is at this point in time in our study, Herod the Great is in control. He's ruling over Palestine. After him comes Herod Archelaus, He was a very wicked man, very cruel man as well. And so we learned that he comes to power during the period of time when Joseph takes his family back into Nazareth. Jesus comes of age and those types of things. Herod Antipas, Herod Agrippa I, Herod Agrippa II. The Agrippas, you remember, were important in connection with the spread of the gospel, or at least they were empowered during the spread of the gospel throughout the known world, because we know that Paul comes into contact with them. Peter and James come into contact with the Herods a little bit earlier than Paul. And so all of those things will kind of come together in our story. But as the book of, or Gospel of Matthew opens, in Matthew chapter 1, what do we have listed there? How does God begin, or the Holy Spirit begin to reveal Jesus Christ to the world through Matthew chapter 1? Genealogy. That's right. So a set of families, right? And those families begin, in Matthew's case, his revelation begins with David, King David. And it was said of David that he was what?
A man after God's own
A man after God's own heart. That's right. So what more fit, or how fitting it is for David to be the one listed as the son of Abraham in Matthew chapter 1 and verse 1. And so he goes back then from David to Abraham, going in reverse, if you will, chronologically speaking, and then he sets his standard there with Abraham and comes forward. Now, what's the purpose of that? Why go from David to Abraham and then come forward? Bill?
It was to prove that Jesus was of the lineage of David.
Okay. All right. And being of the lineage of David meant that he had a place where?
On the throne.
Okay, on the throne. Now, did he have a place on the throne because David was an earthly ruler? No, but because of prophecy, right? Prophecy says that through David will come forth a leader. And we don't have time to go back into the Old Testament and talk about how Christ was a form of, John the Baptist and Christ were forms of some of the prophets, and even, maybe connecting with Moses and all that. That's not the purpose of our study this morning. But we need to recognize that this is the important reason why he began with David, went to Abram, and then comes up through the lineage. All right. So, wise men from what area came to worship the child born as the King of the Jews?
It says the east.
The East. All right. The East. And so our next slide says that they came from the East to worship the Christ child, and they stopped at the palace of Herod the Great. And so when they come, they really don't know where they're going, except for the fact that they were told what? This is coming over into chapter 2 now of Matthew.
The child is born as King of the Jews.
Right, that's right. So now after verse 1 tells us, now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, Magi, or wise men from the east, arrived in Jerusalem, saying, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star in the east and have come to worship him. So they don't know exactly where he is. And so where do you go? You go to the center of not only culture, but the center of rule for Judea. And who was the ruler? Herod the Great, right? And so Herod the Great don't know anything other than, he's an Idumean. What do Edomites know about the law? They were forced to follow it, so they just kind of give it lip service. And so there was a search made, right? And what did the scribes find out about that? Yes, he was to be born in Bethlehem of Judea. They found Micah's prophecy connected with that. So they stopped in Jerusalem at the palace of Herod the Great. Herod called in the scribes to see where the child was to be born, and they were able to tell him it would be Bethlehem in Judea, or Judah. So, Herod the Great says, let me tell you just a little bit of background about Herod the Great. Very, very suspicious. Very suspicious guy. We'll talk a little bit more about that if we get into it this morning. He was concerned that anybody and everybody was trying to take his throne away from him, even family members. And he disposed of a lot of folks as a result of that. So, God warned the wise men, rather than, as Herod had asked them, rather than coming back through Jerusalem, I want you to go home and not stop in and talk to Herod the Great, because Herod the Great wanted what? He wanted to kill him. Under the guise of saying, oh, I want to go worship him too. Now, the Herod's never worshipped anyone but themselves. So Herod finally figures out that the wise men have already gone back. So he ordered all the babies of Bethlehem slain up to 2 years old. And so it was some point in time between the time that the wise men came into Jerusalem and 2 years later that Herod decided he would have all the babies killed. And that's what he did. Conjecture here, wise men may have been astrologers from Media. They looked at the stars and that type of thing. That, whether that's the case or not, I don't know. Again, mere conjecture. So as I mentioned, Herod the Great was obsessed with establishing his dynasty. His life is strewn with dead bodies, really. The ghosts of people whom he suspected of treason or disloyalty. One of the first things he did when he came to rule was what?
Ordered the death of 45 members of the Sanhedrin.
Right, ordered the death of 45 members of the Sanhedrin. Why did he do that? They opposed him, right? Hey, you know what happens when you oppose the king? You get your head taken off. So that was the case here with these men of the Sanhedrin, who were likely what type of people? What people? What sect of people? Sadducees, right. And so what is the Sanhedrin?
Governing authority.
Governing authority, okay. Sometimes I refer to it as the equivalent of our Supreme Court. That would have been basically what it would have been, with the exception that the Sanhedrin could not order the what? I heard somebody say it, I think. Execution. They couldn't order the death of anyone. Only the Roman emperor could do that. And so these were made up of chief priests, elders, and scribes, headed by the high priest of Israel. Had 71 members, including the high priest. But Sanhedrin also refers to the phrase the 70. That is one translation of the word. No power of capital punishment, as we mentioned, reserved for the Roman power. Handed Jesus to Pilate after Jesus' mock trial. You remember that. How that they brought Jesus to Caiaphas, and then Caiaphas and Annas stood before the Sanhedrin and really just told them, we're going to put this guy to death, but we're going to have to do it by the hands of the Romans. And so they worked that out. And so I think that's going to kind of bring us to a close in our study this morning. We'll start there, Lord willing, on Wednesday evening and try to finish this out in connection with the Herodians, or the Herods, more particularly. Appreciate your attention this morning. Appreciate your comments and participation in class.